Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Big Bros podcast. My name is Ilan, and I'm joined by my lovely friend and co-host, Jeremy. How are you?
I'm great, mate. I'm good. It's a day off for me today, and as you guys can see, at the time of recording, I'm sat here in some activewear whilst you, my friend, are sat here looking very dapper.
No,
and
mate,
you've
I
been
feel like
working hard.
I'm
Clear difference between the two of us today.
look. Truth be told, I was, as one of my friends would call placement volunteering. I was busy during the day doing that activity, so that might explain the differential attire choices. But nevertheless, I'm very excited to talk about this episode today because I find, and I don't know if you agree, whenever we catch up with our mates and they're going on dates, there's sometimes a theme that I've observed, which is they're really great and all, but I feel like she's different to me politically, or she has a different worldview. And it's that doubt in their mind that, for me, I find quite fascinating because I'm thinking, what is it about politics or having differential political views in a relationship or a future relationship that could be potentially catastrophic?
It comes up quite often, doesn't it, when we talk amongst dating with our friends, and we almost get excited when we come across someone that actually shares somewhat similar political beliefs, and it might not be wholeheartedly the same political beliefs, but somewhat similar is enough to get people excited nowadays, because it almost seems like there are just so many people, and the majority rather would be more left-leaning, more liberal, when us men are more conservative. And this is what the stats show, and this is what we want to talk about today, because there is a clear discourse between this, and it is ultimately causing a difference when it comes to dating and an inability for people to find compatibility because of this difference on worldview and political belief.
Yeah, there was this political scientist named Ryan Birch. So he had a look at pretty much Gen Zers and millennials and kind of their church attendance, but more specifically their political leanings. And I imagine the way it's worded, this is done in America. And something that he found in his study that I found really interesting, he said nearly half of Gen Z women identify as liberal. So liberal in the US would be more left-leaning compared to 28% of Gen Z men. So that's essentially 50% of women having kind of like an equalized split. Some may be more right, some might be leaning more left, but with men, it's 28% of men identifying as more left-leaning, meaning that 70% that would be more conservative. That could make sense in terms of how that's going to damage relationship prospects, right? Like imagine you're on a date with someone, right? And one person saying, I want Russia to annex Ukraine, and the other person saying, what's wrong with you? Or someone else saying, I'm pro-life, and the other person saying, you can't tell me what I can do with my body. Like, there are so many situations, and I've just picked the most two.
You've picked the two most extreme examples.
I've picked very extreme ones. I haven't talked about your thoughts on negative gearing.
Mate, we could dumb it down even more to just even paying for bills on the date, or getting the door for the lady, or opening the chair, or picking her up and having a little bit of chivalry about you. You know, it seems like there's 50% of women out there that do like that, and 50% that actually think, oh, what the hell? I don't want that. I can do all those things myself. But 75% of men actually would do that. So you're in a bit of a tango here where there's not much alignment as to where you stand. So it's almost like when you do find that person that actually has that similar belief and stance, it's like such a wow factor.
It's true, but I would also caution you and anyone who reads this study to not think that just because they're conservative, they're going to be conservative on every measure. Like they might not be as conservative with things like when it comes to gender roles, or they might be more conservative economically, but more socially left. And we see that. I've noticed that a lot in a lot of our friendship groups. Like we'll see people who are more maybe socially left but more economically right, and sometimes the reverse of that as well. So it's not as simple to say. I think also nowadays, like, people don't know what their politics are. So as an example, they might be really knowledgeable on one issue and be really well versed in that issue, and they're like, okay, am I left or right based on my opinion on this issue? And then they'll say, okay, I'm probably more left. then they'll end up thinking, well, if I'm more left-wing, that means anyone who has a left-wing view about anything must be right. Because if I felt passionate about this specific issue, it means the people endorsing the left-leaning stance on other issues are probably the oracles of truth. And I think that's a very dangerous game to play. I think you should look at things issue by issue. That being said, are your political views a reflection of your values?
Absolutely. And like you mentioned there, not every political view is going to be in line with either right or left, conservative or liberal. There might be a little bit of difference based on the discussion, the topic of conversation. But in the grand scheme of things, they are a massive reflection of your values. So you got to ask yourself, why aren't we talking about this early? Why are we not talking about values and political stance early when it comes to dating? Often we've been told the whole narrative of it's too serious, it's too touchy, it's just not where you need to be on a first date, a second date. You don't need to be talking about political stance. You don't need to be talking about your view on the world. Fuck that. Absolutely you should. I think you should be talking about that more than anything else, because you might figure out that by bringing that into light, either you're actually going to be very much compatible with this person because you're likely to share a lot of the same beliefs, or the opposite, which is also great because it means you're not going to be wasting their time therefore.
Yeah, I think of this as like the easiest example to think about. But let's say you two have differing views on abortion and, you know, whether it's moral or not, you know, the practicality of it, and say you are vehemently against it, whereas the person you're dating is vehemently for it. And then what happens in a scenario where, you know, they end up pregnant and you have to have those difficult conversations? Now, it doesn't really, in my opinion, it doesn't matter what view you've got in that case. It's like your political views, you're entitled to have them. But can you not see how that would cause a discord in that conversation? Can you not see how that would be annoying, or not even annoying, that'd be an understatement. Do you not see how that could be such a deterrence to the longevity of the relationship? Now imagine you have kids with this person and they're watching, and your child's watching the news, right? And they're talking about a politically divisive issue. And you're really passionate on one side of the coin and your partner is really passionate on the oppositional side of that coin. And you don't know how to actually express or educate your child because you know that your political view is so different to your partner's that you're probably going to end up in a conflict, and then that's going to be reflected onto the child. So I don't think politics on its own is polarizing because it is a reflection of your values. It shows you what kind of things you value in life and the things that you kind of stand for. And everyone's going to have differing views. But the thing is, I'm a huge believer, and I want to see if you agree, I'm a massive believer of having friends who have differing political views to you because the conversations are more fun. I noticed it at uni, like I have different views to some of my friends, but there's almost this art that people have lost nowadays where you can disagree with someone and have a respectful dialogue with it without it turning into this insult game. And I love that.
Well, that's the crux of it. It's whether you can actually have a conversation, be open-minded, or not necessarily open-minded, because you might not want to change your belief, and that's completely fine. But are you willing and able and tolerant enough to have the conversation with someone who has a differing belief to you and just hear it for what it is and not start getting personal and deflecting all hatred to them and labeling them as this horrible person just because they differ to that belief from you?
And that's why I also think like that's great in the friendship context, but you know,
it's more monumental in a partnership with someone.
But that's the thing. Like, I don't think if you've got very slight political view differences with you and your partner, I don't think that makes as much of a difference.
Exactly.
But if you've got like whole scale, like if you're voting Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party and the person you're seeing
is Greens,
is Adam Bant, written all over their name, attending every protest under the sun. First of all, I don't think those two are going beyond a first date. But even then, like, those obvious concerns, like there's no chance in hell that's a relationship that's going to last. Like it can be done, but it's just the chances aren't good. And we know how hard relationships are to sustain, and you kind of want to be on the same level footing.
Absolutely. And it can go as simple as the conversation of whether you view young boys wearing dresses as okay. Like if you're someone that thinks it is okay, but then your partner thinks it isn't okay, well, you best believe that you'll probably cross that bridge when it comes to that point of you guys having kids together, and you need to work out how to best communicate that amongst each other, because if there is that discourse there and it's just one of those things that's been swept under the rug, then that child of yours is just going to be left confused. So it's not so much an importance of whether you believe something and your partner believes something, but the actual importance in that situation is the child, because that child is then going to be growing up confused if they're hearing opinion A from mum and opinion B from dad, or whatever it is that you're married to. And you just need to have some level of communication amongst yourselves so that when that obstacle comes, when you do have to have those conversations with your kid about whatever it is politically, the dress scenario was just one example, but you need to be able to have that communication so that your child has an understanding and isn't left confused in whichever way that discussion goes, whether it is conservative or whether it is liberal. Confusing that child is the absolute worst thing you can do. And it's only you and your partner to blame for that, for not having those conversations.
So how do you go about it on a first date, right? Let's say I'm on a first date with someone and my intention is it's dating to marry. Doesn't mean I'm going to marry the person I'm on a date with, but that's the filter in which I'm looking at my dates with, right? I'm looking at are they wifey or are they husband material? And I want to talk and kind of figure out what they like. Am I going to be asking them, hey, what's your thoughts on Donald Trump? Or am I asking them like, is Peter Dud and Voldemort? Or am I going to be asking them more subtle questions aimed at their values? Like things about, what was life like growing up for you? What did you really appreciate about mum and dad? And I'd ask them to kind of reflect on those things, and they might be really deeper questions. I might not ask them in that sort of way, but given that politics are a reflection of your values, you can tend to see a bit more uniformity, right? Like if if the person you're on a date with says like, oh, I love the fact that my mum, spent a lot of time with us, and yeah, I know dad was working a lot, but he was working really, really hard. That probably gives you an insight into the kind of politics or how much they'd endorse certain gender roles, right? So it's like you can draw and kind of infer some things. Better usually to ask them about those things as well explicitly, but maybe on the first date you don't ask them those explicit political questions, right?
Yeah, but I would also take the argument to say that you could just outright say, would you describe yourself as a more conservative or liberal person? And I think that's not a attack. That's not a question that should evoke any form of anger or frustration in the person. And if they're not willing to answer that on a first date, I would even make the argument as to whether they're willing to just be open to dating in the first place, because I would say that it's a very overarching question. It's not a very personal question to say whether you're more conservative or more liberal. They don't need to say what they truly believe in terms of how far deep they want to go in that answer, but it's just more of that overarching question. It's just a basic question about their worldview after all, and I don't think you can do much harm by asking that. But if they do take offense to that, then again, as I always say, it's nothing lost. It's only good for you in that circumstance, because you've probably realized that this person might not be compatible enough for me, because I am willing to have these conversations that aren't too deep, but they're important enough for me to talk about. And if they're not willing to talk about this with me, then I might feel like I'm actually just wasting my time.
Genuine question though, what if they don't actually know their political beliefs? Like if you ask them like, hey, are you more conservative, you reckon? Are you more left-leaning and so forth? Are you more progressive? And they say, look,
good question.
I don't actually know. Like I never cared too much about politics because I thought it was insanely divisive. First of all, I think that's a very attractive answer.
Yeah,
I don't know why.
It shows that you're willing to learn. You're willing to have conversation. You're maybe not so one-way lane down a certain conversation or a certain belief system. So I think that just it's even better in a way, because it opens up conversation.
But I think that can also go two ways. So the first way, in the good way, where I see it as like, I'm not going to have a mob mentality. So I'm not going to necessarily just be hardcore left. Like I'm going to look at things issue by issue. Or it can also mean someone who just isn't very interested in like having deeper level chats about, politics and values. And, there's nothing wrong with that. It's more so just like, it depends what you value in a relationship. Do you value the conversational, intellectual stimulation when it comes to topics regarding politics and so forth? Or do you value other things? And each to their own. But, yeah.
You can keep it light though. I mean, we're calling it political beliefs and political topics and political discussion because that's typically what would be the overarching category for conservatism versus liberalism. But it, like we said before, it goes beyond that. It's just your values at the end of the day. And we can kind of interchange those words for just values. What are your values? How do you view the world? How do you view certain situations? And that's where I think an answer like that can just invite topics of conversation for certain values for that person, and whether that means asking about whether they're religious in any way, whether they have been religious, whether they believe in religion, and maybe what their beliefs are with that, if they're willing to share, or how they view certain things going on in the world at the moment that might not be political but just might be everyday living, maybe talking about the areas they like to hang out in, the types of people they like to hang around, the hobbies they might like to do. You can kind of get a good idea maybe of their value system and their belief system just based off that, by keeping it light and not maybe using the words such as conservatism or liberalism if that scares them or that actually confuses them in a way. Just talking about these things that are just normal conversation and everyday life. But that also just comes with conversation and letting the conversation flow and not being so superficial with your chat, not just talking about how good the cocktails are that you're drinking, but actually talking about life and what life looks like for you and what that means to you.
There's a guy on TikTok, and I forget his name, but he always pops up on my For You page, and he pretty much just interviews random Australians just walking on the beach or at the park, and he asks them, who did you vote for in the last election? And sometimes he gets like these old married couples, and they're like, well, I voted the Liberal Party, and the partner's like, well, I voted for the Labor Party, and they're like, oh, you didn't tell me that. And it's like, I think it's actually interesting in Australia I think we've become more politically divisive over the last maybe 10 years, but I reckon that's because we followed America's footsteps. Because in America, they are it's war. Like, if you have a differing political view to someone, you are literally enemy territory for that person.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid Australia's in that, following those footsteps.
We kind of are. I mean, I remember like when I was in America in 2019, it was a thing where you were told not to ask people whether they're pro-Trump or anti-Trump and who they are voting for or what stance they have. You were told to not actually speak about those things. And in Australia, it was kind of the opposite. It was kind of like we gave a shit about politics, but not to the extent that America does. And everyone was kind of just like, let's just fill out numbers on a paper and whatever happens, happens. And, I feel like that was maybe the more overarching theme. Like, yes, people still cared, but it wasn't as complex in terms of thinking about it as it is maybe in America. But I think you're right. Now it seems like, especially with the past election we just had, it's very much a topic of conversation, and people get offended as to being asked certain questions and to being asked what their viewpoint is. But like we say all the time, if you ask things with care and you approach things with care, people can choose how willing they are to share things. So you're only going to get good from that conversation because either they don't want to share things and you respect that and you move on to the next topic, or they do share things and you're just going to have a great time and a conversation that can just keep free flowing and hopefully be something that is very openly discussed if they're willing to talk about things as much as you are.
If you want to see how bad the online rhetoric got when the election was coming up, you only had to look at Sam Fricker's TikTok page, because he had interviewed, look, in fairness, I think he interviewed Dutton and a few other more conservative members of parliament, but it was just interesting how many people went after him and said, you portray yourself as a diver who doesn't really have a political agenda, but here you are promoting, right-leaning people, and people going after him just saying, disclose your political views. Don't be ashamed by it. Come on, tell us. And it's like, it's such mob mentality. It was so aggressive. Whereas I could be wrong, but maybe in our parents' generation, it wasn't like that. You could actually have a beer with someone and not be too fazed by who they were voting for. And that was that. And I think, look, for a lot of people that still exists, like you can still not necessarily have conflict if you have a differing political view, but I think it's gone bad here, and I think it's going to get worse before it gets better.
And I think a lot of I mean, I can only speak on behalf of guys, but I think a lot of guys feel like they're on eggshells when going on dates with girls and feel a bit scared to maybe talk about their beliefs from the get-go. And I think that's unfortunate, and it's something that is holding back good relationships from flourishing. Seriously, because I feel like a lot of guys end up just dating someone that has different beliefs to them, and they actually don't really align with them, but they want to be in a relationship after all. So they're just kind of settling for that person, even though they don't align with that person. And then that leads to just being unhappy if they can't share their true thoughts and feelings with that person, because they just feel like they're ultimately on eggshells.
Yeah, you're not really authentic then, yeah?
Absolutely.
Like, you want to say the things that you want to say in front of your partner without feeling as though it's going to turn into a political argument each time. And again, I want to emphasize this. Does not matter where you lean politically, but would it not make more practical sense for you to date someone to eliminate that opportunity from happening?
Yeah, of course.
And the thing is, instead of like being on a date with someone, and let's say you are on a date with someone and they have differing political views to you, don't try and convince them. Maybe ask them why they think. And I'm a huge believer. I don't like engaging in political debates with people one-on-one because most of the time I think there's going to be so...
You're banging your head against the wall,
that,
really.
And also, like, can I be honest? Most of the time, I like to learn why they formed the opinion that they did, because sometimes it allows me an understanding into their life. Which is great. Because first of all, it's cool to know, because I have my own views that were formed as a product of me interacting with my environment. And that's different to this person. So what's unique about their position? Maybe is it their upbringing? Is it the content they consume online? Is it specific experiences they've had? And it's like, even if I disagree so much with that political opinion, can I at least empathize with why they have the opinion that they do? Because if that does, then we can at least bring back the human connection. And we've lost so much of that. Because
the problem is that it's very rare to come across a conversation where it's two people in that conversation that have that same mentality. It's typically one person is listening and actually hearing and taking in what that person is telling them, even if they completely disagree, whilst the other person is making them feel shit for having different beliefs. That's where the problem lies, isn't it?
Yeah, you voted Trump, you must be Hitler. Fucking hell.
Yeah.
Like, it'd be conversations
it's that
like
crazy,
that.
Isn't
Instead
it?
of saying like, all right, well, what are your views on Donald Trump? Tell me, like, it's like the guy on TikTok does. He asks them, what's a policy that you like? Is it about that presidential candidate? Or, well, that's in America, but what is it about this political view or this conversation that speaks to you? Was there anything in your life that you experienced? For example, like, you know, if you're more economically left-wing and you need more assistance from kind of government and so forth, was there a position in your life where you had to rely on government services?
Yeah.
And perhaps you weren't able to overcome the trials and tribulations without that support. And maybe you weren't in that position. So it's worth listening, because I think after all, we are humans and we do forget that. It's like we treat it like a sports team. It's like Carlton Collingwood most of the time.
Exactly. And to bring it back again to that dating scenario, which is, you know, the whole point of this topic, it goes for the same reason as to, you know, whether you choose to split the bill or whether you choose to pay in full as the guide maybe, or whether you choose to pick them up or whether you choose to meet them at the date, or whether you choose to, you know, walk them home to make sure they get home safely, or whether they choose to, you know, do things their own way independently. And just having that conversation and talking about the why in that conversation should feel very, I guess, gentle and comfortable to navigate. But obviously, if that person is not willing to share, well, you've learned something there as well, that maybe it might just take time to share, or on the other hand, you might just not feel like you're compatible with them, and that's completely okay.
So be gentle, but don't be afraid of the conversation.
Absolutely. Every conversation needs to be approached with an element of being gentle. And I think this is where a lot of it can get misconstrued on dates, because you often hear situations where, you know, maybe you've gone on a date with a person and you remember having a particular conversation with them, which in your mind was really good, and their mind, it seemed to be good as well. But then you hear that they've been sending messages to the group chat later in the bathroom being like, oh my God, he asked me about this. Can you believe that? And it's like, well, it's not necessarily about the question that they asked, but maybe about how they asked it. Was it asked with a nice, gentle tone? Was it asked with caution and care, or was it asked in a very direct, straight up, abrupt, maybe condescending tone? Tonality is a big factor here and can change a lot of perceptions. So if every situation, especially in early dating, is approached with that gentle, calm demeanor, you would think that you are very much likely to avoid getting yourself into hot water.
Yeah, well, that's it, isn't it? On that note, guys, we hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Send this to a friend. They may have just come back from a date and they might be thinking they're the one. But gee, they're going to all these protests every week and I don't know if I'm compatible with them. Send it to them because I think this is a very important discussion to have. And beyond all the jokes, I think this is something that can implicate you going forward. So do take it seriously.
Absolutely. On that note, guys, happy Tuesday. Have a good week. And we're keen to hear your beliefs.